Welcome to the 8th presentation on presentation and writing tips. Today I will go through the discussion chapter, the discussion section, more in depth. I will talk about its various components and some of these components can in principle be in separate follow-up chapters. So we'll talk about when to do that, what to think about and how to structure these components. And as before, this is a part of teaching material of ISP Group, free to use, as long as you say where it's from, part of the CDIO course that we are now approaching the end of. So, this slide I already showed you in previous videos, and it's just to remind you that in all scientific writing you want to say something, and each chapter has their own aspect that they want to say, and in the discussion what we want to do is to put the main statement in a more nuanced perspective. So if the main statement is, for instance, that type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance may be explained by feedback from the protein mTOR to some other thing, then in the discussion section we argue around that. Why is it interesting, and what are the weaknesses, what are the things that might still not, that one should think about, how does this imply things for the future, and so on. So it's sort of more nuances on the main statement. So now let's see how you can structure a discussion section in a systems biology project. So as you probably have noticed by now, I like these mind maps. So let's have the discussion in the middle, and then let's see how we can have various components and structure them. So the first thing that you typically start with is a mini summary, and then you say, well, we come up with this main point, and then this and this. So maybe the three most important things that you come up with, or maybe only one. But the sort of mini summary just to sort of recapture the focus on the essence of what you said. Because at this point you are sort of leaving the result section and you have become fairly technical. So here at this point it's good to sort of know what are the main statements, so that you then can start to put these main statements into a more nuanced perspective. And then these nuances is that you want to highlight the strengths and the limitations, weaknesses. And the strengths, they are typically of a character that you shouldn't miss this thing. And the limitations are of a character that, well, our results only hold if this, or this is a weakness of our thing. So, and these strengths and limitations can be of many types. But just to get your thought process going, I will highlight some things that basically can go in both directions. So they can both be strengths and limitations, and sometimes both actually. So for instance, the quality of the data. So for instance, here you might say that well, we used primary human cells, and this is important if you want to understand the human disease. So then it would be a strength. Or it might be a weakness. So you might want to say that we use primary human cells, and for that reason we cannot do all the cool perturbations that you can do in cell lines. So that one might appear both in the strength paragraph and in the limitation paragraph. And the same with the agreement with the data, between the model and the data. Some aspects of the agreement is typically good and that you shouldn't miss. And some parts of the agreement are not so good. And then you might say that, well, our results depend on this being good enough, for instance. Or maybe you simply say that this is a weakness of the model and we will take it up in future work. And another thing that usually can go in both directions is what kind of methods you used. So if your methods are unusually cool and have some nice strength, then you should point that out for those methods. And you should point out that because we have used this and this very cool method, we can say this, which we couldn't have said otherwise. And then you might also say that if you want to check this statement even more, then you should use this other method. And here, pointing these things out, so for instance that we didn't use, we used this method and it has these limitations, and we could have used this other method, but we didn't, might actually be what makes or breaks an entire paper. So if you don't mention that there is this other method that you could have used but you didn't, then you might get the whole paper back saying that, well, the author is obviously not aware of the important the other ways that this could have been done, and is not known, has not the wide knowledge of the field. But then just saying this one sentence can actually salvage that whole situation, so that it shows that you are aware of the alternatives. So, on the plus side, we have done something unusually good, and on the minus side, we could have done something better. And all of these has to do with sort of comparisons with the literature. So, what could we have done? What have others done? Where are we better? Where are we weaker? And then I should also say that these comparisons with literature can be either a part of the strength and the limitations paragraphs, or it might be a specific paragraph where you have separate comparisons. So, for instance, you might want to highlight some specific person X and say that it is interesting to relate these findings with those of X. And then you might have a whole paragraph where you compare your findings with those of X. And then in that paragraph you say both strengths and limitations compared to this other work. And you might also say something that of the kind that we are the first to claim said. And then you typically also compare that with other people who have been close, and then you say they have said this which is close, but it's not really what we say, so we are really the first, and these other guys have said something else which is close in some other way. They also have some limitation. So then you might start a paragraph saying this, and then you have all the arguments for it. And if you have many of those, maybe you don't have to have separate paragraphs for the limitations and strengths. And vice versa, maybe you only have a mini summary, strengths, limitations, and then you start to zoom out, and then you have no separate paragraphs on other things. So here it is clear that there is no universal logical way of structuring these paragraphs. So you typically start with a mini summary, and then you have various paragraphs which are relatively isolated things. They don't have to lead to each other, but it's more that you have one paragraph that compares with X, and then you say this, and then maybe you go on to general strengths and limitations, or in some other way. But they are relatively fragmented and isolated units, where it doesn't have to lead to each other in the paragraph, as it should in an introduction, for instance, or in the results section. But then, when you have said all of these things, you start to zoom out. And then you start to talk about where does this lead in the future, and what are the impacts of this for society, and ethical considerations, and this might help solve important things. And this typically leads to some clutchy ending or to a separate conclusion section. So you typically start relatively zoomed out, saying the main points, and then you put the nuances, and then you zoom out in the end. So here you have lots of variation possibilities, but this is relatively standard that you start with this and you end with this. So, what about this conclusion section? What is that? So it's something that you may have as a separate chapter or section, and you may skip it altogether. And you may also have that instead of the discussion chapter or section. It depends a little bit on what kind of story you have. But usually if you have experiments along, you have at least a discussion section. You might also have a conclusion. But if you have something that is really theoretical, then maybe you only have a conclusion. And the conclusion section should summarize the main findings. And here it should be really short. It should be a little bit longer than the introduction to the discussion, but it should not be longer than an abstract. But it's not the same as an abstract, because the conclusion section should only have a really short, maybe not at all, introduction. So maybe you start by saying that here we show this, and then we show this, and then we show this. But you say more on the main findings than you do in the abstract. And maybe the most important difference between the conclusion section and the abstract is that in the conclusion section you can assume that the reader has already read the rest of the report or thesis. So here you can use all the technical details and the words and the abbreviations and all of that you have introduced earlier on in the text. So this is something that comes at the end of the text as an integrated part of it, whereas the abstract comes is a sort of separate thing, which is a standalone, where you don't assume that the reader has read anything else. And then what about the future work section? Well, the future work section is also something that you may have as a separate chapter, as an integrated part of the discussion chapter, or as something that you skip altogether. And in the future work section, you start to look ahead. So you ask questions like, if you would want to go on beyond this thesis and beyond this paper, what would be the next logical and interesting steps? And as I said, this is optional. So this is something that you may skip altogether and may just have as a sort of a paragraph in the discussion chapter. And you may have it as a sub-section to the discussion chapter. Maybe I should point out that this is something that is more common in a thesis than in a scientific paper, to have a future work section and chapter. So let's just end with 3 open discussion points where you can think yourself, you can vote online, and we will also discuss these things in the upcoming lectures when we meet physically. So the first question is, if you want to say something that is a detailed explanation of the differences between your results and those of some X person, where would you put that? Would you put it in the abstract, background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, or future work? And you might want to fill in one or several. And same question, but if you want to include a summary of your results using several non-standard technical terms, where would you include that? And the final question, if you want to give some comments on where this might lead us next, where would you include that? Okay, that's it for now.